In this video, I'm going to introduce the WIDA English Language Development Standards Framework. So first, what are the WIDA ELD standards? So as you've learned thus far this week, WIDA is an organization that has introduced standards for English language development for students identified as English learners, as well as an assessment that those of you in classrooms, I imagine, have heard of, the Access Test, and a lot of professional development resources for teachers for supporting multilingual learners. The WIDA English Language Development Standards specifically focus on the social, instructional, and academic language that students need to engage with their peers, their teachers, and the curriculum in schools. So it's designed as a way for educators to have a sense for where students are in their English language development journey and where they're going next and how to support them to get there. So I'm going to unpack these different components of the standards framework. And then after watching this video, spend some time looking through the standards to get a sense for how they're organized and how they could be useful for you in your current or future classroom. So the WIDA ELD standards framework has these different components. There are standard statements, which are kind of the framing of how we think about language and content integration. So because all students are learning content as they are learning language when they are multilingual learners or bilingual learners in a bilingual program, the WIDA standards keeps that in mind as we think about supporting language development across content areas. We then have key language uses, so the main functions for language use across disciplines, language expectations, which is really the standards, and then these proficiency level descriptors that help us think about the different stages of language acquisition that students are currently at, and how they might be supported within those different stages and also to get to the next stage. All right, so starting with the first piece, the standard statements are very simple. They say that students need to develop language for social and instructional purposes, language arts, mathematics, science, and social studies. So WIDA has taken kind of the core areas that the core content areas that students are learning in at school, and used those to think about the language within those different disciplinary areas. And again, that's because our multilingual learners are not only learning language at school, but they're also learning their content through language. So it's a way to organize how we think about the language supports you might need for learning in math versus learning in language arts, science, or social studies, or socially. So that's kind of the overarching statements. Then we move down to the key language uses. So WIDA has pulled out 4 main language uses or language functions that are the most common ways that students are engaging with language at school. So students are asked to argue, to narrate, to inform, and to explain. And they're also asked to read texts that do these things and write texts that do these things. Now, of course, there are a few functions that are not mentioned here. We don't see procedural texts. There's students are not kind of asked to sequence here, or they're not asked to do. It doesn't cover every single function we could imagine, but it does embody most of the ways that students are being asked to use language at school. So this is how the standards are then grouped, thinking about using language to argue, using language to narrate, using language to inform, and using language to explain. And WIDA was, the 2020 standards were designed with a functional perspective in mind. So they talk about genres, which are any kind of text types that share a characteristic. So we might think about these different genres and how they're used to accomplish different purposes, and then the language that's used in them. So using those 4 functions that WIDA identifies, we could think about how language is used in fictional narratives to accomplish its purpose of telling a story, how language is used in an explanatory text or in an explanation that tells how something happens, how something works, how language is used in an argument where the goal is to persuade, and how language is used in a report where we're trying to inform, right, provide information. And so each of these different genres has a different purpose and accordingly has a different organization and different language features that help it to accomplish that purpose. So the WIDA standards were designed with this vision in mind, so that you can really think carefully about not only the content area that you're focusing on as you plan for language, but also the different types of genres that students are engaging with, and the language features of those genres. Okay. So now we move to the, let me move my video there. We move to the standards themselves. So this is what they look like. You can see the grade level band, grades 2 and 3. You can see that this is language for language arts. And then you see the key language function there, or the key language use in the corner. So this is focusing on narrating. Underneath that, you see the language expectation, which is really the heart of the standard. So that is the language standard. And here you see they divide them into both interpretive, which is kind of their word for receptive language, so language coming in, and expressive language, or language coming out, productive language. So you see what students are being asked to do here. They're asked to interpret language arts narratives, and then it gives them specific standards by identifying a central message from key details, identifying how character attributes and actions contribute to event sequences. So that's what they're able to do with language interpretively. And then we see here what they are expected to do with language expressively, right? Construct language arts narratives. So now they're writing narratives or speaking narratives that orient the audience to the context, that develop a story with time and event sequences, complication, resolution, or ending, that engage and adjust for audience. So those are the big picture standards. Then down below, you see this list of language functions and sample language features. And this really is an amazing resource, because as you're planning how you might want students to be able to reach those language standards, you can then see examples here of what specifically you could focus on. So let me give you an example of this. Okay, I'll give you an example of this in just a moment. First, I want to get to this last part of it. So we had our standard statements, our key language uses, those 4 main language functions, the actual standards, the language expectations here, and then the final component of the framework is you have these proficiency level descriptors, where students are, where it gives you an idea for what students could do for each of these components of language at each level of English language development. So this is a great resource when you're thinking about differentiating, or just want a sense for, what you might expect students to be able to produce and what the next stage is that they're working toward. And I wanted to point out here that WIDA, again, helpfully divides these features into word phrase level, sentence level, and discourse level. I like to use the metaphor of building, creating a building, to think about how all of these pieces fit together. So you might imagine your word and phrases would be kind of like bricks. But students need to put those bricks together in meaningful ways, right? So to create sentences, to build that wall. And then it depends what you're working toward, right? So what it is you're trying to build with these words and phrases and sentences, the discourse level. Are we building a school, or a library, or a gym? A workout facility, right? So depending on what we're building, we need different organizations of our words and phrases and sentences. So this is how kind of WIDA breaks apart the way that they present language development. So for word and phrase, they talk about different type of language, everyday language, which might be like our tier 1 language, tier 1 words, like C, cross-disciplinary language, which we might call tier 2, like observe, more academic sounding words that you might encounter in lots of different disciplines, and then more technical language like magnetism, that tends to be tier 3 level in a specific content area, right? Content specific. For sentence level, we might think about grammatical complexity, how complex the sentences are we're working with, if we're using compound words, or if we're using to create complex sentences, words like because and until, grammatical structures, verb tenses, pronouns, all of that is part of the sentence level. And then for discourse level, how we're organizing the text, how coherent it is, the cohesive devices we use to connect ideas. So for an explanation, if we're explaining, how something happens, so explaining how a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, we would need to use sequential language to do that, right? But if we're writing a report about wolves, we don't need to use sequential language. We need to use devices that help organize our ideas into coherent subtopics, where wolves live, what wolves eat, what wolf families look like. And then density of language, how much information you're packing into sentences. So this is how we can think about the language that students are developing, and supporting them along the way. Okay, so here's this visual again, with the bricks and the wall and the full discourse features. Okay, so here's the example I wanted to show you of how you can then use this framework to plan for language. So here we go back to that initial example that I shared, and I've pulled out the language from the language expectation for my standard. So my English language development standard for my students might be that multilingual learners will interpret language arts narratives by identifying how character attributes and actions contribute to event sequences. So I just pulled that language right here from the standard. And then for a specific lesson, I might set a language objective of how students will be working towards this. So I went down below and I looked at, okay, so if I want them to be looking at character attributes and actions and how those are contributing to event sequences, here we have that, developing the story with time and event sequences and some specific language goals or language features. So I wrote the language objective. Students will be able to identify how story is developed through verbs that describe what characters do, think, and feel, such as wondered, exclaimed, devoured, shared. So this gives me a really targeted language focus that they're going to think about story development through what characters are doing. And I pulled out some specific types of verbs that we might focus on in a story that we're deconstructing together, or maybe we're going to co-write, jointly construct a story, so that they can start to think about how stories develop. I should say, in this, because this is interpretive, right? They're reading. It probably would be a text that we're reading together, and I want them to be able to identify these verbs and think about then how they're helping to develop the story. So I know this is kind of like drinking from a fire hose. It's a lot of information, but I hope that this gives you a sense for the wonderful resource that this WIDA ELD framework is, and how the standards can be used to inform instruction and to help you think about how to plan for language for multilingual learners.